Hello Bannerlords, welcome back to another army vs army battle. This time, the fight takes place in the desert with me commanding for the Aserai. My opponent has 891 soldiers while I have 1079. At the start of the battle, I rush to find a good position for the ground units. Ideally, you want to place your ground range units on a slope above your ground melee units. Doing so will ensure they carry on firing arrows at the enemy without obstruction. If you were paying close attention, you would have noticed I had commanded both the mounted melee and range units to hold fire. The Aserai Vanguard Faris can throw javelins, which are inaccurate but deadly. It is a non-issue if you command them to throw it into groups of enemies, as the javelins will likely hit someone. The Aserai Mameluke Heavy Cavalry can fire arrows. However, they only carry one quiver of arrows. As such, you want to use those arrows sparingly. Make use of their high mobility to go for the flanks or come from behind the enemies. Now, with the mounted units positioned at the opponent's flank, they responded by sending their mounted melee units to engage. I commanded mine to follow me before charging. As the enemy got closer, I commanded my mounted range units to fire their arrows as well. Ensure that the troops do not move too near the opponent's main force. With the enemy's mounted melee units dealt with, I commanded the mounted range units to move closer to the opponent's main force. An opportunity to take out a chunk of the archers had presented itself. I initially thought of using my mounted melee units to charge in before backing away. I changed my mind and ordered them to push through the site to avoid clashing with the enemy's ground melee units. Situations like this are an excellent time to use javelins as the enemies are near each other. After dealing some damage, I commanded the mounted melee units to back away and got the mounted range units to cover fire. This action suppressed the enemy ground units, forcing them to back away instead of firing at the mounted melee units that were retreating. Now, with their backs facing towards me, I got the mounted melee units to charge into them, with their melee weapons dealing a significant blow. Let's take a look at what happened from the top down. I separated the army into two and placed the mounted units at the opponent's flank. The opponent retaliated by sending the mounted troops to engage, but was quickly defeated. I then charged into the side of the enemy's main force before withdrawing. The opponent took this opportunity to reposition their ground range units to fire at my mounted units from behind. I commanded the mounted range units to fire, suppressing the opponent's ground range units and forcing them to back away. I then followed up by sending the mounted melee units in again, inflicting a heavy blow. Things were looking good, till I noticed the opponent was getting reinforced from behind me. I immediately commanded the mounted troops to retreat. As my main force came into view, I could see a large group of enemy ground melee units close by and about to engage. I commanded the mounted range units to move and get in position to fire at their flank. I also ordered the ground range units to spread out, increasing their effectiveness. Next, I commanded the mounted range units to back away, increasing the distance between them and the incoming ground melee units. At this point, the enemy ground melee units were getting dangerously close to the ground range units. I commanded the ground melee units to charge, to deter the enemy from pushing past the front line. Fearing the mounted range units were in danger of getting attacked by a large force of enemy reinforcements, I commanded them to back away. I then commanded the mounted melee units to assist both the ground melee and mounted range units. You can find out where the units of each formation are by selecting them. Keep an eye on the mounted melee units and do not let them spread too thinly. Order them to move to a safe position in the map to gather them before charging again. Mounted melee units are more effective when moving as a large group. The ground melee units are now slightly scattered. Being scattered at this time is bad, as more enemy reinforcements were approaching. I instructed the ground melee units to return to their original position using the line formation. At the same time, I got the mounted melee units to assist by moving across the battlefield. This maneuver destroyed a vast number of the opponent's forces. Ensure that the mounted melee units regroup some distance away so as not to be shot by the enemy ground range units. The opponent's troops were now in a very disorganized state. As no other enemy reinforcements were in sight, I commanded my units to charge in from 3 different directions. Let us take a look at what happened from the top down again. After withdrawing the mounted units due to incoming enemy reinforcements, I engaged the opponent's ground melee units from the flank. They responded by rushing towards the mounted range units but failed, due to their high mobility and support from the mounted melee units. As the enemy reinforcement had arrived, I ordered the mounted range units to fall back. I then commanded the ground melee units to charge with the help of the mounted melee units. At this point, the ground melee units were starting to get disorganized. I commanded them to fall back and use the mounted melee units to sweep across the battlefield. Finally, I commanded the mounted melee and range units to charge with the ground melee units to finish off the enemy forces that remained. The battlefield was chaotic, but victory was imminent. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you did and would like to see more videos like this in the future.